Part 2 of World Conquerors. The Real War Criminals. Chapters 5 through 8. By Hungarian nationalist patriot in exile, Louis Marshalko. Translated into English by A. Surani. Published in 1958. This audio-video book is recorded, edited and produced by Joey Faust and the Phoenix Party Christian Fascists. Chapter 5. A Movement Maligned. As a result of the suppression of spiritual freedom all over the world, we live in a kind of thieves' kitchen, concocting a flash hypocritical series of slogans in the place of free speech. There are certain taboo-like problems to which one is not supposed to refer. There are certain persons one should not name. There are also certain matters not to be mentioned in the language of Western civilized man. Speaking the truth means facing either the gallows of Nuremberg or the loss of one's daily bread. Nevertheless, we must say a few words about National Socialism. Christian resistance should have followed at the moment when Bolshevism broke out in Russia and when the work of Jewry became visible through the Versailles Treaty. The message to Christendom should have been the restoration of unity in disorganized Europe, the instruction of the nations and the elevating of the Christian conception of hierarchy, thus guarding the individual against being reduced to herd level. Bolshevism as well as soulless liberal capitalism should have been effectively mastered by their only real adversary, by Christian resistance all the time pointing the way upwards toward heaven. Perhaps Christ himself might have come with his scourge to drive the money changers out of the house of God, thus restoring justice, goodwill and social peace, and once more he might have addressed his Christian people with Peter's forthright words. Save yourselves from this untoward generation. But Christianity was reluctant to adopt revolutionary methods in order to wrench world power out of the hands of those whom Christ, the founder of Christianity, attacked on Maundy Thursday. The spirit of Christianity should have impressed itself upon public life, upon governments and upon the press and trade unions, but it failed miserably to fulfill its mission. Germany became a stage for the rootless fellow traveler of the Weimar democracy. The leaders of Hungarian and Polish Catholicism tried to preach Christianity to the poverty-stricken masses from the shelter of their large estates. The Italian and Spanish clergy remained in the enjoyment of their worldly wealth. Protestantism, as seen by Axel Munda, was unable to give faith, or to follow in Luther's footsteps, who, taking his stand with the people, exclaimed, "Here I stand and I cannot do anything else." But history will not tolerate unfulfilled duties and unsolved problems. In the East Bolshevism was established, while in the West reigned the atheistic, speculative power of gold. The socialism of Christ was unable to find its wings. Therefore National Socialism had to come. Opinions may differ as to whether National Socialism was a neo-pagan movement from the beginning or whether certain mistakes crept in later. But it is indisputable that National Socialism, after coming to power, undertook to fulfill, under various slogans, those tasks that ought to have been performed by Christianity. No doubt it would have been much better had the Christian churches in the turbulent hours of the upheaval of 1919 declared war on Bolshevistic atheism, on the immorality infesting European societies and on corruption, defeatism, capitalist exploitations and Marxist class liberation. But the Christian churches had developed a glasshouse Christianity. Unlike Christ, who, though unarmed and sitting upon an ass, and a colt the foal of an ass immediately made his presence felt by both word and deed, when he rode into Jerusalem, an anemic incapacitated Christianity restricted to empty prayers, proved itself to be only a passive witness of historic events. The fatal mistake of the churches was in not supporting the social aspirations of the masses, but rather in backing on every occasion the actual holder of state power. During the period between the two world wars, prayers were said from both Catholic and Protestant pulpits not so much for the living members of the church community, i.e. for the masses, as for the welfare of the ruling power. Thus, in England, they prayed for the king, in France for the Republic, in Hungary for the regent, in Italy for Mussolini, later, in Austria for Hitler, just as pacifist priests are ready to say prayers today even for Khrushchev. In any case, one accusation has to be deleted from the charges, rightly or wrongly brought against National Socialism. In spite of what occurred later, it was not in its early days a movement of the masses. It stirred the masses, but not with any intent to gratify the needs of the masses. The elite of the German intellectuals, who were not necessarily identical with the actual leaders of National Socialism, came to recognize that the most dangerous point in the scheme of both Bolsheviks and Jews to obtain power consisted in their intention to reduce free and intelligent men to the herd level, to transform them into a malleable formless mass, which could easily be kept under control by the Tommy gun. Against this, the early years of National Socialism saw the development of lofty aspirations, as well as the growth of the concept of the elite. It campaigned not for the class struggle but for higher national morality, for freedom, for social order and justice, and for national culture which would not be offensive to others. National Socialism could never have arisen had it not been for the fact, for instance, that learned Jewish professors in Germany set up experimental brothels for children with boys and girls of 12 to 13 years of age. Could such a national disgrace ever have been perpetrated had the way not been prepared by a series of financial swindles with public funds and by communist plots? Hans Grimm, the greatest champion of the German spirit in Europe, the great German writer who later fell out with Hitler, even after 1945, described the conditions that gave rise to the National Socialist Revolution as follows: an unyielding predilection for an ethnic community and a striving towards national integrity, coupled with a passionate eagerness for Anglo-German cooperation. There was general anxiety for reform in a changing world. This mass movement recognized new values, both spiritual and physical, as was demonstrated by basing the currency upon production instead of upon gold. Furthermore, the claim that quality must be protected against quantity was also upheld, and the whole of this great experiment set out to prove that the spirit of Versailles must be abolished for everybody's benefit. German National Socialism not only proclaimed certain principles but, in its initial stage, at any rate, endeavored to put them into practice. The promotion of intellectual elite, the suppression of the class struggle, the establishment of peace between capital and labor, the building of homes, the raising of the working classes' living standards, the cultivation of family ties, the well-planned settlement of the proletarian masses, and the securing of a peaceful old age through the creation of social insurance, were all constructive forces of indisputable value. Doubtless they still play a basic role in present-day German life and make possible the rebuilding of democratic Western Germany, although since the German economic and monetary system is now closely geared to the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank network, and so to the power of gold and usury, these constructive forces are to some extent being warped by an unsuitable framework. For it was a tremendous achievement on the part of National Socialism to have established a currency system covered by the value of the nation's work and by the volume of the national production, which at the same time brought about the overthrow of the omnipotence of money as a commodity and also that of the domination of gold. Although its leaders were not necessarily frequent churchgoers, the National Socialist state accepted and carried out Christian principles by establishing order and social justice. It is clear that for this to be accomplished, destructive social forces had to be eliminated. It was inevitable, therefore, that National Socialism had to stand up against the relic of 1918 defeatism as well as against the subversive activities of the Jewish spirit. It had to make a stand against the Jewish Bolshevik and the Jewish capitalist, being aware that the unrestricted autocracy of the golden calf only engenders discontent, envy, and class warfare. It makes little difference whether or not the Jewish question was overemphasized by National Socialism. It is of no importance either that National Socialism actually adopted the racial theory of the Old Testament as one of its instrumental devices, for even had it forsworn these, it would still inevitably have clashed with world Jewry, which could not tolerate the existence of any other nationalism on earth. The National Socialists might have treated Jewry as humanely as possible, but this would not have altered the fact that the secret power exercised by Jews over the German Reich was being taken out of their hand, which was absolutely intolerable for them. Besides, they could not afford to contemplate such creative energy, such striving towards national unity, such influence wielded by an elite, all of which were things bearing irreconcilable hostility towards the power aspirations of world Jewry. They could not bear the fact that by the elimination of the power of gold, not only were state power and the means of influencing public affairs wrenched out of their hands, but the secret power as well. In any case, from the moment world Jewry realized that Germany was being ruled by a conscious elite, it would have promptly turned against National Socialism with just as much hatred as it actually did when anti-Semitism gave an excuse for it. In losing Germany, Jewry lost a territory from which it had exerted power. Therefore, it was determined to reconquer it. For a century, world Jewry, Marxism and liberal capitalism had been adopting mass production methods to transform the people into unthinking masses, the free individual into the proletarian. They had realized, of course, that only unthinking herds could accept and endure the yoke of Judah. In Germany, National Socialism at least arrested this process. In spite of his liberalism, the Spanish author Ortega y Gasset, in his work The Uprising of the Masses, long ago drew attention to the danger inherent in people being reduced to herd-like masses. Lothrop Stoddard, professor of Harvard University, also insisted that an uprising of the masses must be prevented. By its accomplishments, German National Socialism clashed most violently with Jewry's plans, since the role of the mob is clearly laid down in the protocols which speak of that same blind slave of ours, the majority of the mob. Protocol X. And again, from all this you will see that in securing the opinion of the mob we are only facilitating the working of our machinery. Protocol 13. To achieve world power auxiliary troops are needed. And these consist first and foremost of the masses themselves. To secure the independence of a nation, men of outstanding quality are required. While destruction is the basis of Jewry's world domination, constructive work is the foundation of real freedom. Thus, to ask whether or not the Hitlerite regime was really bent on war is beside the question. There is no point in assuming that Hitler and the German leaders were madmen. We might, with more justice, admit that National Socialism had war declared upon it from the very moment of its birth. It was condemned to war because it was a system which inevitably made enemies of Bolshevism and world capitalism, i.e. of those forces forever looming in the background. Without making a single anti-Semitic manifestation or the slightest unfriendly pronouncement, National Socialism would still have made enemies of Jewry on account of the successful completion of the leveling up process. In this connection we will once more quote Hans Grimm, who states fairly and concisely in his book The Answer of a German, between 1933 and 1939 more was done for public health, for the mother and child, as well as for the promotion of social welfare than before and, perhaps we might admit, than ever before. At this time even Winston Churchill had a different opinion of National Socialism from that which he professed later. Churchill wrote of Hitler in Step by Step, "If our country were defeated, I hope we should find a champion as indomitable to restore our courage and lead us back to our place among the nations." But National Socialism was condemned to war for this very reason. At the moment when Hitler took power with the determination of abolishing the system of Versailles and of raising his own people, then somewhere in the veiled secrecy of the lodges and in the mystic inner shrines of Jewish nationalism a declaration of war was immediately decided upon. One problem only remained, i.e. whose nerves would prove the stronger. Who would be able to take up best an appearance of peaceful intentions, and who would be hanged later as war criminals? Can we be sure that America will also come to heel, was the question the Jews must have been asking themselves at this time. We can be sure that the Soviet Union will be on our side when the Great War comes. We can also rely confidently upon the France of Leon Blum, of Renaud Mandel, of Lazarus Bank of the Grand Orient and the Rothschilds. We can be certain that when the time comes, the England of the Sassoons, of Rufus Isaacs, of Horbelisha, of the Gallickers, Strachey's and Laskey's will fight to further our ends. But suppose the people of the American democracy draw upon the results of experiences gained in the First World War, what then? What will happen if, at a critical moment, isolationism, represented by the Mayflower Yankees, gets the upper hand, saying that the United States have nothing to do with a war between German and Jewish nationalisms? Perhaps the Americans will have no interest in fighting for Danzig. But we Jews will. For Hitler is standing on the balcony of his chancellery, supported by 80 million people singing the Horst Wessel song. Die von Hoch. Let's raise high the flag. The people are marching through the Brandenburg Arch in dense columns of 8 after liberating themselves from our domination. The fist of the German worker, previously clenched in hatred and envy, now unclenches in the friendly salute of the open palm. One of these two nationalisms must perish. We shall respond with the guns of America or China or Japan, is written in Protocol 7. Therefore, we must first conquer America to ensure the conquest of the world. We must Bolshevize or socialize America from above without it being noticed. For America's constitutional form is democracy. This is the best constitutional system when the true will of the people prevails, and the worst where secret hands falsify the national will. In America, the people are proud of their freedom and of their democratic education. The American worker is as proud of the Industrial Revolution as the capitalist himself. In America, everybody is equal before the law. Both the descendants of the early pioneers whose fathers came on the Mayflower as well as those of the little Jew from Galicia can declare, with equal pride, civis Americanus sum. Democracy is the most ideal way of life, provided there is no individual group, party, race or sect successfully fulfilling in secret aspirations detrimental to the rest of the nation. As soon as such a parasitic force develops inside democracy, democracy itself is reduced to nothing. It is transformed into a minority-ruled herd. The right of the vote becomes a myth, since public opinion is being shaped by the press of this alien nationalism. The parliamentary system is debased to that of a theatrical act, for senators will be influenced by an artificially created and therefore false public opinion. The government will be run no longer on the lines originally contemplated, as laid down by the legislature, because the government itself will be manned by the members of this secret force, a minority will, dictating by their power of the purse and directed by the advice of their brains' trust. We Jews, as the spokesman of this clannish nationalism might put it, are well aware that in America, England, France and the Soviet Union, as well as in every other part of the world, the rule is, Judah must come first. As long as the interests of America are identical with the interests of Old Testament Nazism, we will be good Americans, but as soon as our interests begin to conflict with the interests of America, we shall betray her too. Generally speaking, democracy suits us if and when it is led by as many Jews as possible. The so-called freedom of the press is good for us, provided the descendants of the seed of Abraham above all can avail themselves of it. Yes, this freedom is a valuable thing, but only where we Jews are at liberty to do anything we like. Oh, you faint-hearted ones, who listened terror-stricken to the marching SA and SS troops, be not afraid. By now we are experts in undermining and capturing democracies. We are familiar with the methods of imposing our particular interests on the masses. America, the richest state of the Goyim, is being shaken by a mortal economic crisis. The time is ripe to start our all-out offensive, which will also give political power into our hands. And ours will be a takeover of a more permanent character than that of Hitler. We are going to conquer America neither by arms nor by theories. We possess a more reliable prescription to call down Nemesis on America. The fate of America was prescribed by our own firer, Moses. Torah is our main camp. According to Leviticus, chapter 25, the third book of Moses, all estates and properties in Israel were to be redistributed every 50 years. All mortgaged lands and all slaves were to be redeemed. Every half-century there was to be a great social reform in Israel. Old debts were to be cancelled and the poor were to be given a share out of the assets of the rich, or, as we might say today, prosperity was to be restored, i.e. money, property and land was to be distributed again in equal shares. Every 50 years this was to be heralded by trumpets. This social reform, the spokesman for Jewry might continue, was called the New Distribution. In America it will be called the New Deal. These words translated literally into English mean our great social reform, the New Distribution. But this time we will not be distributing the assets of the Israelites, but of the Americans and, of course, in such a manner as to ensure that the Americans will be left with as little as possible, and our own people with as much as possible. This will be the year for sounding the trumpets in America, where in Washington's time the total number of Jews was a mere 4,000. But now our bankers, our socialists and our journalists will be blowing trumpets, and our brains trust will execute the New Deal at the expense of the American pioneer population. Thereafter the only remaining question will be, whom are we going to put in the presidential chair at Washington? Those of you living in despair in your palatial residences in Wall Street or in 13th Street, as well as in the ghettos of Brooklyn and Bronx, must not doubt that we shall find our man, the real match of Hitler, who will, at the same time, place political power over America into our hands. You need only read our directions in the forged protocols. Liberalism produced constitutional status, which took the place of what was the only safeguard of the Goyim, namely despotism, autocracy, editor. Then it was that we replaced the ruler by a caricature of a government, by a president, taken from the mob, from the midst of our puppet overture, our slaves. In the near future we shall establish the responsibility of presidents. Protocol X. We shall arrange elections, this protocol continues, in favor of such presidents as have in their past some dark undiscovered stain, some Panama or other, then they will be trustworthy agents for the accomplishment of our plans out of fear of revelations. Who shall, therefore, be the new president, who will place America in our hands and who will execute our orders? His name is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But who is this Franklin D. Roosevelt? Robert Edward Edmondson, under the heading Famous Sons of Famous Fathers, the Roosevelts, answers this question in his book, I Testify. On March 7, 1934, the Carnegie Institute compiled the family tree of the Roosevelts, from which it is evident that the President of the United States is of Jewish descent. His ancestors came to America about 1682, they were Claes Martin Zinn van Rosenvelt, and on the distaff side Jeanette Samuel. They were originally of Spanish Sephardim descent Jews who had escaped from Catholic Ferdinand's persecution in 1492 and who had gone to England. From the time of their arrival in America the Roosevelt family tree is studded with Jacobs, Isaacs, and Samuels. The New York Times of March 14, 1935, quotes the president as saying, "In the distant past, my ancestors may have been Jews. All I know about the origin of the Roosevelt family is that they are apparently the descendants of Claes Martin Zinn van Roosevelt, who came from Holland." But according to the Carnegie Institute, Mr. Claes Martin Zinn Rosenvelt was a Jew. Furthermore, Roosevelt's well-known wife is herself a Jewess. Europe, or to be more precise, Germany, lies between the two jaws of the pincers. Here, from the Jewish point of view, dreadful events were taking place. The collaboration of German capitalists and workers, as well as the solidarity of the middle classes and farmers, demonstrated that the class struggle is far from inevitable. Marx's theory of destruction was being disproved, whilst the golden calf had well-nigh lost its prestige when it was seen that production and not gold was to be the true basis of the new world. All that has been taught and eulogized for more than a century as world progress has now been destroyed, of course, not by a German corporal, but by the spirit of the modern age. Against the tide of world domination surging from the Eastern Hemisphere, the symbolic flag of the swastika was arising. This could not be tolerated by world Jewry. Yet, fear not, declares the spokesman. Around the puppet, Roosevelt, our advisors are now gathering in conference: Felix Frankfurter from Vienna, Morgenthau from Mannheim, Bernard Baruch from Königsberg, and Albert Einstein from Berlin. Samuel Roseman, who writes Roosevelt's presidential speeches, is there. So are our labor leaders, amongst them our compatriot Sidney Hillman, who controls American labor in the administration of our puppet, FDR. There is Mr. David Dubinsky, also a fellow immigrant from Russia, who will transform the Christian American workers into taxpayers for Zionism. The entourage of our president will consist exclusively of trustworthy men, such as LaGuardia, mayor of New York, a Jew from Fiume, and Alger Hiss, the pro-Geoff Frankfurter, and of Senator Lehman, etc. Bernard Baruch will control the 351 most important branches of American industry and will equip the American boys who are going to fight against Hitler. On behalf of America, Alger Hiss will conduct the talks with Stalin. Einstein, Oppenheimer, and David Lilienthal will produce the atomic bomb. As managers of UNRRA, LaGuardia and Herbert H. Lehman will help the future Jewish victims of the coming war. Henry Morgenthau, Jr., the Secretary of the Treasury, will prepare a splendid plan for the extermination of the German people. Our Mortiz Gomberg will see to it that 18 million people from the countries of our enemies will become stateless in Europe. Our men will be distributing checks of $11 million to provide the Soviet with arms. What a magnificent dream! Americans will sail across the ocean to punish our enemies. In the lodges of B'nai B'rith, the Moscow-New York axis is ready to function. Do not worry. Roosevelt will provide the armaments for Russia. Well, did not a little heated prophet write 20 years ago? The Western Jew will equip an army of 20 million on the East to destroy Christianity and human culture and to establish Jewish world kingdom. Chapter 6. The Real War Criminals. Hitlerism was not the only thing that world Jewry hated. They dreaded even more those movements paving the way for a new understanding amongst the nations of Europe. Jewry's main aim was to discredit these new trends as well as to make them disliked by the rest of the world. While campaigning on one side for full cooperation, they tried to strangle on the other side all those who were collaborating with their enemies, the Germans. They unhesitatingly opposed even the slightest thought of making peace, writes Maurice Bardache. But today we have definite proof that the Germans tried most earnestly to establish cooperation and partnership among the European elite. They were not looking for quislings, but for those who were considered good patriots in their own country, people dedicated to the cause of their own native land. An almost exaggerated idealism pervaded the elite of the National Socialist Revolution. In their own country they stated what they believed to be the truth. They recognized that the individual has social rights. They demonstrated that this is the only satisfactory solution on a national basis, if Bolshevism is to be avoided. They believed with revolutionary fervor that if they could succeed in liberating the European masses from capitalist exploitation, then peace might be secured for a long time. They had seen how Jewish Nazism interposed itself to disrupt the unity of the German people by means of its money power and its control of the press in order to secure exclusive domination over the entire nation. Having success fully done away with all this by their National Socialist Revolution, they had high hopes of securing peace and also the cooperation of neighboring peoples, once the influence of that supranational Old Testament Nazism was eliminated in these countries too. This was New Europe in the making. And this was the very thing world Jewry had to prevent at any cost, even if it entailed reducing the Christian culture of Europe to the dust. Because, should this plan succeed, more and more states would be released from the grip of Jewish domination. Therefore the mere thought of European unity, or of any possible cooperation, had to be discredited. And because more than the 60% of the press of the Western world is in Jewish hands and, according to American statistics, 85% of the American press and 100% of American films, this campaign was conducted on a larger scale than any other propaganda operation in the history of the world. By misinterpreting the racial concept, the Jews pretended that the Germans were claiming sole supremacy for the German nation over all other nations. Thus they succeeded in estranging the other nations from Germany. They distorted the racial theory by insinuating that Germany wanted to conquer the world and on the basis of this theory was claiming world supremacy. The 19th Century magazine in its issue of September 1943, during the height of the war, admitted on the contrary that the general belief that Germany started this war to achieve world power is, in our view, a mistake. Germany wanted to become a first-rate power, but to be a first-rate power and to achieve world domination are two different things. Great Britain is also a world power, but she does not rule the world. The Jews also falsely interpreted the theory of Blut und Boden, blood and soil, i.e. the theory that a man belongs to his native soil. The concept of a unity between a country and its inhabitants was so twisted as to suggest that the Germans claimed all those territories in which any inhabitants of German origin happened to be living. By this means, they aroused the jealousy of all independent European nations where German minorities were to be found. Poland, Lithuania, Hungary, Slovakia, Yugoslavia, Bohemia, Romania, and other neighboring states began to regard with distrust the German Reich. They tried to explain away Germany's steadily growing export trade as a preparation for war and attempted to make the world forget that Göring's slogan of guns or butter had a precedent in the boycott by American Jewry. They ridiculed the sincerely pro-British parts of Mein Kampf, at the same time working on the fears of both East and West by quoting certain passages of this book out of their context. This poisoning of the mind was thus stimulated on a gigantic scale throughout the world. When the German administration tried to stop this troublemongering at home, it was promptly accused of dictatorial tyranny. As a background to all these forms of anti-German propaganda there was, of course, the undeniable fact that the abolition of the reign of gold together with the establishment of peaceful cooperation between capital and labor was a real shock for Jewry. World opinion was induced to believe that the German workers' living standard was rising only because of rearmament. But, in fact, they knew very well that large workers' settlements were everywhere under construction, and that the existence of the workers and satisfied families was a living refutation of those things taught by Jewry for over a century. What can have happened, they asked one another in fear. Have these hated Nazis really wrecked the splendid theory of the Marxist class struggle, which was serving our ends so well? As Bettelheim expressed it, can great cities such as Berlin, Vienna, and Budapest get along without Jews? Can a nation really live without exploitation, without a Jewish nationalist press, without the films, theater, and Jewish mercenary spirit? After all, we have kept the whole world under our influence for centuries by suggesting that without our cultural activities, our business sense and supercilious intellect all nations would perish and all progress would cease. And now Germany prospers without us, with a prosperity which is the living negation of our arrogant nationalism. Anybody looking at these steadily growing garden cities, at the satisfied and happy people and at the prospering intellectual and economic activities, can see that our great nationalist writer, Bettelheim, was wrong when he predicted that world civilization would perish without the Jews. So far, these Christians are becoming more and more satisfied, while we Jews are losing more and more ground. If the rest of the world learns about this on an international level, and if the foreign tourists and the world's proletariat see that all this is possible without us, indeed, even against us, they will realize that we have lied to them. Our politicians, journalists, trade union leaders, capitalists, and labor leaders will all become liars. Therefore, we must destroy the proofs. Therefore, these nice homes with their gardens, together with the new factories, day nurseries, youth camps, and hospitals must be wiped off the face of the earth. For we have at our disposal our secret nationalist weapon, the same one used with such effect at the siege of Jericho. Let us, therefore, sound the trumpets for our world propaganda. World Jewry must be regarded as the sole war criminal of the Second World War because, in the first place, it prevented reconciliation between the nations and the possibility of cooperation, destroying even the prerequisites to these aims. With the help of untruthful propaganda and falsehood, and by use of radio and press, it projected a totally false world picture before the eyes of mankind. It created a general world atmosphere in which the mere utterance of the truth in connection with the German question might entail danger to life or loss of livelihood, or suspicion of high treason. All peace offers made by the German statesmen were labeled sheer lies. It derided all sober and honest plans. It made all social achievements in Germany appear as reactionary red tape, all the progress as an anti-progressive obstacle, every manifestation of the elite concept as barbarism, and all forms of anti-Bolshevism as anti-democratic. Colonel Charles Lindbergh, the national hero of America, became suspected of high treason when he dared to state his honest opinion about National Socialism, based on his own personal experience. Meanwhile, in 1938, Roosevelt, who can only be regarded as a puppet of the Jewish Brains Trust, sent the following gaily worded wire to Churchill for the promotion of war preparations. "You and I can rule the world." World Jewry declared war on Europe and on Christianity at the very moment Hitler came to power, or perhaps even before. The anti-German boycott movement flared up in America as early as 1932. Jewish organizations published full-page advertisements in the New York Times reading, "Let us boycott anti-Semitic Germany." Seeing that this did not have much result, they began to prepare the New York-Moscow axis. Forrest Davis in his book What Really Happened in Tehran, the contents of which were reviewed and published in the Saturday Evening Post of May 13 and May 20, 1944, reveals that as early as 1933 Morgenthau was preparing for the resumption of American-Soviet diplomatic relations. And the first Soviet ambassador in Washington's land was nobody else but the bloodthirsty Soviet commissar, Litvinov Finkelstein. Before President Roosevelt, the direct descendant of the Roosevelt family, came to power, all this would have been unthinkable. The common denominator that actually brought together American democracy and Soviet tyranny was Jewry. James Whiteside, in an article, Mr. Roosevelt and Communism, describes with appalling vividness in the columns of the St. Louis Dispatch how as soon as Litvinov appeared on the American scene, a fearful procession of communists, i.e. of Jews, began its march towards the White House. Roosevelt gave special permission for the installation of a very powerful Soviet broadcasting station in the Pentagon, the American War Office, thus infecting the high command of the American forces with the most pernicious propaganda. As early as 1933, the editor of the New York Morning Freiheit, a Yiddish paper with a circulation reaching several 100,000 copies, called upon American and world Jewry to unite all Jews in the war against Nazism. The American Jewish Congress, led by Rabbi Stephen Wise, joined the movement with avidity. In 1933, also, Rabbi S. Wise, on Hitler's advent to power, announced a holy war on the part of Jewry as follows. "I am for war." This memorable announcement was made on May 8, 1933, Edmondson, I Testify, page 195. It is evident that at this time not even the outlines of the German General Staff's plans for 1940 were drawn up, for which Rabbi Wise and company hanged the German military leaders. A speech had previously been delivered by Morgenthau on February 11, 1933, declaring war on Hitler. The U.S. has entered the phase of a second war, announced this prominent leader of Jewish Nazism. Portland Journal, February 12, 1933. In the meanwhile, various Jewish and communist boycott organizations were springing up like mushrooms in the United States, scheming to ruin Hitler's economy. A joint anti-Nazi boycott committee was already fully active in 1936, while Hitler, even in his wildest dreams, could not guess the exact time when the clock would strike and he would have to try to free himself from the mortal embrace of the Hydra whose coils entwined the world. It can now be proved historically that the youthful National Socialism was right in fearing that Jewish nationalism would make a fatal ring round the Third Reich from which it would be impossible to break out, even with the help of arms. But was this fear really justified? Who held power in the United States, Great Britain, France, and Soviet Russia? Concerning the question of war guilt and warmongering, the same motive remains for our consideration which constituted the principal problem of Roman law as well as of any legal system throughout the ages. Cui prodest? Who will profit from the war? Whose interests are promoted by it? The only interest of German National Socialism was the maintenance of peace. The last attempt to prevent the outbreak of the Second World War was when Ribbentrop visited Moscow to conclude the non-aggression pact with Stalin. On August 23, 1939, Hitler summoned to Godesberg 2,000 officers of the General Staff. This secret consultation was a bluff intended for Britain. So was the impressive march of endless columns on the roads, and the endless flights of Air Force formations near the Führer's Eyrie. Even the most stupid agent of the intelligence saw clearly that this was a bluff. Regarding Britain, it was evident that although war had been decided on, it was still possible to make peace. Hitler in a speech lasting 4 hours declared, "Do not think, gentlemen, that I am an idiot and will let myself be forced into war because of the question of the Polish corridor." But at this moment an invisible hand reached out to take an active part in directing the flow of events, the same intriguing hand which consistently embroiled matters in the background. After the Godesberg meeting of the General Staff, Soviet Russia signed the non-aggression pact with Germany. This was closely followed by the Bromberg massacre engineered by another invisible hand. This real war crime, recorded in detail, together with the relevant proofs, in the German white paper published in the autumn of 1939, was later hushed up in Nuremberg. Although the artificially constructed horror scenes of the Todesmuhl, Mill of Death, for the shooting of which wax figures were used in the various scenes, were shown in the cinemas, the film of these horrors which had really happened, as published in the white paper, were never shown in any cinema. Women with truncated breasts, mangled male corpses with the sexual organs cut off, bodies of German babies and 4- to 5-year-old children impaled on butcher's skewers. Thousands and thousands of slaughtered innocent people about whom the humanitarian world remains silent. These were German victims in Poland, whose population was saturated with 3 million Jews, and where the Jewish-dominated press had by then whipped up hatred and the desire for war. By this time, the German and Polish divisions were standing face to face on the frontiers. It was no longer a question of the corridor, but a flaming brand had been thrown right into the gunpowder barrel. Whose hand and money was in this massacre? Was it brought about by the extreme patriotism of the Polish people, or was it coldly calculated and satanic planning? Was it a Soviet or an English hand? Such a thing is hard to conceive. Nevertheless, this is the decisive question in determining war guilt. To sec hecatombs of massacred victims well before war had even started was a thing National Socialist Germany could not tolerate. This situation was forced upon her in order that Britain and France could begin a preventive war against Germany. And so on September 1, the next day, the German divisions were really marching. "Since dawn today we are shooting back," said Hitler in the Reichstag. Footnote. Late at night on Thursday, August 31, 1939, the editor was listening in to Gleiwitz, a radio station on the German-Polish frontier but just inside Germany. Suddenly, after midnight, the musical program stopped and excited German voices announced that the town of Gliwice had been invaded by Polish irregular formations marching towards the emitting station. Then the station went dead. When received again at about 2 a.m. Friday, Polish was being spoken. Cologne radio gave out that German police were repelling the attackers of Gliwice. At 6 a.m. Friday, September 1st, the German army invaded Poland. A few days after the outbreak of war, the editor saw a small paragraph in the English press to the effect that the Germans claimed, among other things, that the Poles had started the war by invading Gliwice early on Friday morning. End of footnote. We will, of course, be told tomorrow morning, writes Maurice Bardèche, a French professor, that Hitler has attacked Poland. Certain people have been waiting and longing for this moment. They were expecting this attack, having been hankering and praying for it. These men are called Mandel, Churchill, Horbalicza, and Paul Reynaud. The Great League of Jewish Reaction was determined to have its own war. This was its holy war. They knew very well that only such an attack could give them a chance to capture public opinion. It will not be very difficult to find the necessary proofs in the German archives that certain gentlemen in cold blood prepared the conditions which made this attack inevitable. Woe betide them should the true history of the war ever be written. Though the first part of the Great World Plan succeeded, and on September 3, 1939, Great Britain and France declared war on Hitler, nevertheless the two most important partners, America and the Soviet Union, were still missing. The greatest secret of the Second World War is still due to come to light and shock the world. Perhaps it will be told only after the fall of Bolshevism, when the archives of the Kremlin will be available. What promises were made by the Western world conquerors to the Eastern? The Soviet Union showed another face towards the German Empire. This face was cool, sedate, and sometimes a little mystically Asiatic or patriotic, but had no Jewish features. The most horrible blunder made by the leaders of National Socialism was when they believed this change to be genuine. Ribbentrop, during his conversation with Sven Hedin, said that Bolshevism had changed for the better and that Stalin was a great man. Sven Hedin, without commission, in Berlin. Stalin, the cunning Georgian, however, did not believe the same of National Socialism. Before signing the pact with Ribbentrop, he suddenly demanded another Baltic port. Hitler agreed to this, sending his approval by telegram. On learning this news, Stalin remarked shrewdly to Molotov, "Germany has just declared war on us. My only reason for asking for this port was to test the Germans. I knew all along that if they let us have this port, they intend taking it back from us later." Plevier, Moscow. Despite this, both parties were scrupulously observing the full text of the pact, including the division of Poland and the question of oil deliveries. Hitler, Ribbentrop, Göring, and even Goebbels were all taking meticulous care not to hurt the sensitive Russian bear. Stalin bids farewell to Krebs, the German military attaché, with a kiss. All the signs seem to show that this alliance of fire and water is genuine. Then one day Molotov, Soviet commissar, husband of the beautiful Bolshevik Jewess, Karpovskaya, and brother-in-law of Mr. Karp, one of the greatest war industrialists in America, appears in Berlin. The date shown by the calendar is November 10, 1940. France is lying prostrate, while over the British Isles the great air battle is raging. The German army is taking a rest. Then Molotov places on the table the Soviet demands. They contain claims to the Dardanelles, the occupation of Finland, and the conquest of the Far East. Everything they contain is unacceptable to Germany. These demands can hardly have originated anywhere else but from the Anglo-American opponents of Germany. The leaders of Berlin were now confronted with the consequences of their greatest error. Bolshevism, after all, had not changed, it was only wearing a different mask. The power in the Kremlin remained Jewish, only its real character remained invisible until it succeeded in involving Germany in the Second World War. By this time, the Kremlin must have had guarantees in hand that the arsenal of democracy would help the Soviet with money and arms against Germany. As we all know, Felix Frankfurter, one of the most influential men of the U.S., had by now prepared the Lend-Lease Act, and it was approved by Congress as well. But will this war prove to have been in the interests of America? No, it will not. The war will not be in the interest of the American people, but in the interest of American Jewry exclusively, i.e. in the interest of persons like Manuelski, Beria, Morgenthau and Bernard Baruch, as well as of the immigrants from Germany and of the refugees from France. As is shown by statistics of the Gallup poll, also in Jewish hands, on June 3, 1941, 83% of the American population was against entering the war. What real interest had America in recrossing the ocean once more? The German admirals Raeder and Dönitz had clearly stated that invasion of America was as impossible as an invasion of the moon. Senator Barkley pointed out on March 31, 1941, that had Germany wanted to attack America, the deliveries of arms to Great Britain would already have provided a good reason for this. Sober American people could see no reason why they should be involved in the war. Charles Lindbergh said, "The entry of America into the war would lead to chaos lasting several generations." Mr. Ikes, the U.S. Secretary of the Interior, himself of Jewish descent, replied to this by accusing Charles Lindbergh of being the Quisling of America. 83% of the American people, including Republicans and isolationists, are Quislings too, just because they did not want to march behind Morgenthau. Roosevelt himself, impelled as he was by the brain trust towards war, was obliged to admit that the Americans did not want to intervene. America cannot even be suspected of having any commercial interest in the war through the arms traffic, for this was an ideological war. Therefore, world Jewry began shouting the command of the protocols as the Christian armies approached Moscow. "We will answer you with American and Chinese guns." If mankind were capable of serious thought, it would have asked itself, what was the point in America's entering the war, and especially on the side of the Soviet? The responsible German leaders issued the following statement. "It is quite certain that the peace which will follow the German victories will not be of the Versailles type, but will be a peace for the benefit of all nations. The people of those countries occupied today will regain their freedom, but in the common interests of all nations, they will have to compromise with certain legalities and conditions." At the same time, Roosevelt sent the following message to Congress. A peace treaty at this time, which would give control over the occupied countries to Hitler, would amount to the recognition of Nazism and to the likelihood of a new war. We want to secure freedom, including religious freedom, for all nations and for each individual. Religious freedom, says this neat slogan. But freedom of which religion? By this time, the Christian armies invading Russia could see for themselves the closed churches by the ruins of Christianity which had been destroyed by Bolshevik Jews, as well as, perhaps, the statue of Judas erected by Bolshevism in commemoration of Christ's betrayer. But from the cataclysm of war, from the surge of blood and fire, from the smoldering ruins of destroyed cities, from the thunder of bombs dropped on innocent children, Roosevelt, the most fateful figure of the 20th century, now emerges. This war will be Roosevelt's war, the right-wing Republicans were saying. But people like Morgenthau, Baruch, Frankfurter, Einstein and Oppenheimer knew better. This war will be our war. World Jewry's war. For Roosevelt, this late descendant of the Spanish Sephardim, was the prototype of the 20th century politician. In him was to be found the personification of the protocols, although he was world deliverer and puppet at the same time. Standing behind were the real masters of America. Freemasonry and the elders of Zion, Zionist leaders and bankers, and the Galician-born trade union Bolsheviks. He is our president, they said, and his war will be our war. We have substituted a caricature for the real government, say the protocols, with the president elected by our creatures and slaves, the mob. It is obvious that by now nearly the whole of the American legislative and executive power was in the hands of Jewry. The anti-Semites could only see the little Jews crowded in Galician ghettos or the small grocer of Brooklyn. Jews stood also behind the chair of Roosevelt, beside the successor of Washington. At this time when Roosevelt was trying to involve the United States in war against the expressed wish of 83% of the American population, Jewish power in the U.S. government was to be seen by the following appointments. Bernard M. Baruch, the unofficial president of the U.S. Judge Samuel Roseman, the founder and head of the Brains Trust, Roosevelt's unofficial advisor. Professor Raymond Moley, favorite personal advisor. Professor Felix Frankfurter, chief legal advisor, Securities Act author. Henry Morgenthau Sr., unofficial advisor, Jewish state lawyer, author. Justice Benj N. Cardozo, unofficial advisor. Gerald Schwope, unofficial advisor. E. A. Feline, unofficial advisor. Charles W. Taussig, Brains Trust advisor. Nathan Margold, Interior Department solicitor. Charles E. Wizanski Jr., Labor Department solicitor. Professor Leo Wallman, Labor Strike Board. Rose Schneiderman, Labor Advisory Board, Radical Labor Unionist. Isidore Lubin Jr., Labor Bureau Statistical Expert. Sol. A. Rosenblatt, Amusement Administrator. E. A. Goldenweiser, Federal Research Director. Jerome Frank, General Counsel. Mordecai Ezekiel, Economic Advisor, Agricultural Department, co-author AAA Laws. Herbert Fays, the brains of the State Department. Henry Morgenthau Jr., Secretary of the Treasury. David E. Lilienthal, TVA Director. Sidney Hillman, Labor Advisory Board. L. N. Landau, PWA General Solicitor. L. A. Steinhard, Minister to Sweden. Professor Albert E. Taussig, NRA Advisor. Alexander Sachs, NRA Code Authority. Maurice Karp, NRA, Director of Personnel. Robert Freshner, CCC Forest Army Head. Robert Strauss, NRA Assistant Administrator. Donald Richburg, NRA Advisor. H. I. Strauss, Ambassador to France. Ferdinand Pecora, Special Investigator. Samuel Untermeyer, Stock Exchange Bill Advisor. Professor James M. Landis, Federal Trade Commissioner. The Hidden Empire, page 12. A hidden power, able to keep under its control a country of 150 million people, governing from key positions through its brains trust and from behind the presidential chair, is a terrible thing to contemplate. But Roosevelt required the help of this far-reaching and omnipotent power in order to involve America in the Second World War. From American sources no secret had been made of the fact that, after trying in vain to drag America into the war against the expressed will of public opinion, Roosevelt carried on provoking the Japanese with various schemings and plottings until they were left with no other choice but to attack Pearl Harbor. During the German assault against the eastern half of the World Kingdom, Japan, the other potential enemy of Bolshevism, had to be neutralized, even if it meant the entry of the U.S. herself into the war. But under no circumstances did Roosevelt want to enter the war before securing his re-election as president for a third term of office. This is the reason why he said in 1940 at Philadelphia in his pre-election speech, "I say to you fathers and mothers again, again, and again, your sons shall not be sent to die on foreign soil unless attacked." Rear Admiral Robert A. Theobald, ex-commandant of the American torpedo flotilla stationed at Pearl Harbor, in his book published under the title The Real Secret of Pearl Harbor, exposes how Roosevelt prepared and provoked this attack against the U.S. With a series of irrefutable proofs, Rear Admiral Theobald establishes that Roosevelt himself brought about the catastrophe of Pearl Harbor. On November 26, 1941, he sent such an insulting note to Japan that she was left with no other choice but to attack. With the help of the note of November 26, states Admiral Theobald, President Roosevelt purposely and irrevocably unleashed the war for the United States. Japan's attempt to avoid the stranglehold was without success. She had either to surrender or to fight, and there was no doubt about her choice. Despite the fact that American intelligence had acquired the secret code of the Japanese fleet several months earlier, so that the American High Command knew in advance of every movement of this fleet, the Commandant of Pearl Harbor received no message at all, inform him that, due to the outcome of diplomatic negotiations, a Japanese attack was imminent. As much as 4 weeks earlier, the chiefs of staff knew very well that the Japanese intended to overrun Pearl Harbor. They even knew the exact hour the Japanese warships and carriers left their home ports to attack Pearl Harbor. They succeeded even in intercepting the secret Japanese telegram containing the text of the declaration of war and commanding at the same time that this declaration was to be handed over to the White House at the exact time the first bombs were falling on Pearl Harbor. This catastrophe could have been averted easily, but President Roosevelt eagerly awaited the attack. He expressly forbade the American fleet to leave Pearl Harbor. 4,575 unprotected American soldiers died, 18 ships, amongst them 4 great American warships, were destroyed. But Roosevelt and those standing behind him attained their aim. I say to you fathers and mothers again, again, and again, your sons shall not be sent to die on foreign soil unless attacked, booms the promise of our president amid the thunder of the bombs falling on Pearl Harbor. And now he stands on the deck of the Potomac with the same hypocritical face, surrounded by other Pharisees heartily singing onward, Christian soldiers, the well-known Anglican hymn. A 1-1 the time he knows very well that he will scrap the recently signed Atlantic Charter in much the same way as he broke his promise to American fathers and mothers. To the Pope, Roosevelt writes that the Russian form of dictatorship is not as dangerous to Christianity as the German type of despotism. Roosevelt, who was a well-informed politician, knew very well that this was not true. So did the advisers standing behind him. Nevertheless, they declared it to the Pope and to the nations of the world. Those advising him and compelling him to make hypocritical promises were well aware that through exploiting his vanity, they could lead this democratic dictator into any venture. FDR is our president. Yes, the president of men like Litvinov, Frankfurter, Kaganovich and Baruch. Perhaps he is the Messiah himself, whose shadow hovers over the bombed-out ruins of Christian churches, over the smoldering debris of Budapest, Berlin, Vienna, Sofia, and Belgrade. Today, it is an acknowledged fact that, before his death, Roosevelt was envisaging himself as the first proclaimed president of the World Republic through the medium of the revived UN, and there were definite plans relating to this already drawn up. And ye shall possess greater nations and mightier than yourselves sounds the eternal promise. The fact that Roosevelt progressed from peace to war, from the New Deal to the firm of DuPont Nemours, from the Atlantic Charter to the Yalta Agreement, from the promise given to the Pope of establishing and maintaining a just peace to the principle of unconditional surrender, from Freemasonic humanism to the Morgenthau Plan and from democracy to friendship with Bolshevism is the tragedy of mankind. All this is an appalling example of a statesman corrupted by Jewry. He is the philanthropist who causes the bombing of women and children, the champion of peace who prepares war, the great Democrat who is a much greater dictator than Hitler himself, and the leading American who by his actions turns out to be a Jew. The most calamitous figure of the 20th century is neither Hitler nor Stalin, it is Roosevelt. And in those days when Christian armies were so near to the Soviet capital that they could see the spires and turrets of Moscow, and when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, it was only appropriate that Churchill should go to the telephone and say to Roosevelt, "Now we are all in the same boat." Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. Behind them the Eastern and Western Jews, Kaganovich and Baruch. The emblem of our nation, the symbolic serpent, has closed its ring, say the protocols. Not long after these events, a photograph appeared in Life. Harry Hopkins, one of Roosevelt's closest advisors and administrator of Lend-Lease, stands in the middle of a group. On his right, Litvinov Finkelstein presents a greasy grin to LaGuardia, who is handing over in accordance with the Lend-Lease Act the first American check to the Soviet Union. It is a sum of $11,000 million, contributed by the hard work of American fathers and mothers to aid Soviet barbarism and to help the Bolshevik dictator. Well, had not a visionary written in his ignored prophecy? The Western Jew will equip an army of 20 million men in the East to destroy Christianity and civilization and to establish the Jewish world kingdom. The prophecy of Cassandra has come true, and the evidence to prove the identity of the real war criminals has also been established. Forrestal, who became American Secretary of War during Truman's presidency, and who was probably killed by the sinister power that dominates the world, records his conversation with Joseph P. Kennedy in his well-known diary under the date of December 7, 1945. Kennedy had been Roosevelt's ambassador in Great Britain at the beginning of the last war. The entry in question reads, "I played golf with Joe Kennedy today. I asked him about his consultations he had in 1938 with Roosevelt and with Neville Chamberlain. He thinks Chamberlain was convinced that Britain had no means to enable her to fight against Hitler. Therefore, Chamberlain was not entertaining the idea of going to war against the Hitler regime. Kennedy's own view at that time was that Hitler's Germany will be fighting against Russia without being later involved in war with Britain." William C. Bullitt, also of Jewish descent, Roosevelt's ambassador to France in 1939, was pressing Roosevelt persistently to take the firmest possible stand against the Germans in the Polish question. Were it not for the ceaseless encouragements given from Washington, the English and French would never have made a casus belli out of the Polish question. Bullitt maintained emphatically, said Kennedy, that the Germans will not fight. Contrary to this view, Kennedy was of the opinion that the Germans will go to war promptly and that they might even overrun Europe. Chamberlain came to the conclusion, said Kennedy, that America and world Jewry had driven Britain into the war. Let us admit, therefore, that the real war criminals were never brought to trial at Nuremberg. Chapter 7. Why Hitler Had to Go. Could not all this be merely a nightmare of anti-Semites? Is it possible, after all, for a 5 or 6% racial minority to drive an immense country like the USA into war? Is it possible for the Soviet to fight side by side with the hated capitalists? Let us review the strength of this racial minority in the two giant countries. Let us begin with the Soviet Union, since we know by now that her founders and leaders came mostly from the ranks of the world conquerors. During the Great Purges, the world conquerors sacrificed a few individuals from their ranks. But the places thus vacated were filled by others even more loyal to Stalin's dictatorship. Stalin's wife, Rosa Kaganovich, is the daughter of Lazarus Kaganovich, ex-commissar of Soviet heavy industry. At the outbreak of war, power in the Soviet Union was in the hands of the 6 members of the Kaganovich family and in those of the head of the secret police. Beria was also of Jewish descent. According to American reports, general conversation in Stalin's home was conducted in Yiddish, even up to quite recent times. Many of the commissars have Jewish ideas. Molotov's wife is a Jewess, whilst Litvinov Finkelstein, ex-deputy commissar of foreign affairs, so capitalistic in appearance, was the visible link between the eastern and western halves of this tribal nationalism. In 1935, Yates Brown brought out his book European Jungle, and on page 181 we read that in the Central Committee of the Communist Party, consisting of 59 members, 95% were Jews, i.e. 56 members, while the other 3 members were married to Jewesses, Stalin, Lebov and Osinski. Sometimes Jews risk bragging about the power they exercise. For example, in the American Jewish Chronicle of January 6, 1933, page 19, we find the following. In Soviet Russia, every third Jew is employed in an administrative capacity. This actually means that out of the 3.5 million Jews in Soviet Russia, more than 1 million hold administrative offices in various key positions of the Bolshevik dictatorship. They are the most loyal, intelligent and fanatical supporters of the Bolshevik system. They become commissars, party leaders, loyal Soviets, provincial governors and senior officers, as well as commissars of the army and of the NVD. After the Great Purge ordered by Stalin at the end of 1936, the top-rank officials of the 40 Soviet republics, i.e. the party secretaries who were holders of actual executive power, consisted of 4 Russians, 2 Armenians, 1 Georgian, 1 Buryat and 41 Jews. World Service, 1936, I-1. When in 1941 the European armies crossed the Soviet frontiers, they were shocked to find Soviet rule more Jewish in character than had been proclaimed even by Stryker's propaganda. Beginning at the Polish frontier, in all the provinces up to Stalingrad, Jews exclusively were the leaders of the towns, the commissars in charge of the collective farms and the chiefs of police. All Soviet commissars, all secret police officers, and leading officials captured by the Germans belonged, without exception, to the same world-conquering race. The high command of the Soviet army also contained many Jews, and in this connection we find the following quotation in a book entitled The Hebrew Impact on Western Civilization, published in New York in 1951 by Dagobert Davis Runes. In the war fought against Hitler, there were 313 Jews amongst the Soviet generals. J. Zaltzman was in charge of the production of tanks, and Abraham Wickbosky controlled the arsenals and gun foundries of the Soviet Union. Mikoyan directed all war production and war contracts. It is quite understandable, therefore, why these co-racialists tried to escape from the European troops when they had a chance to do so. But the Russian and Ukrainian populations could relate many appalling crimes committed by these people. The proofs are not far to seek. Any soldier serving on the Russian front can corroborate these facts by his own experience. The fearful power exercised by more than 500,000 Jews thus kept the so-called Soviet system in being. The statement of certain propagandists that the Bolshevik system does not suit the Jews because they cling to private enterprise is simply ridiculous. Wherever Bolshevism was established, Jewry promptly changed its commercial and industrial key positions for those of public office. Thus the grocer became the police officer and the shopkeeper a state official. The partisan of the first stage of the protocols was thus transformed into the professional soldier of the second stage. All this was known by a few Americans. Hamilton Fish, a congressman of New York, as early as 1933 referred to the Jewish character of the Soviet, and certain data and figures were published in the Congressional Records of February 29, 1933. According to these, the Soviet government, including the governments of the provinces, consisted of 503 members, of whom 406 were Jews. Out of the 23 members of the local Soviet in Moscow, 19 belonged to the race of the world conquerors. Among the 42 editors and publishers of the official press were 41 Jews, led by David Zaslavsky, editor, and Ilya Ehrenburg, publisher of Pravda. Douglas Reed, the eminent English journalist, reported in 1938 that press censorship in Russia was firmly in Jewish hands, and that a certain Epstein controlled film production. Whenever any connection between Jews and Bolsheviks is exposed, Western propaganda readily points out that now and again anti-Semitic tendencies are to be observed in Russia. But the truth is that until the end of the Second World War, Soviet Russia was the only state in the world in which anti-Semitism was declared a crime by law and in which the criminal often suffered the death penalty. All this logically follows from the teaching of Lenin that anti-Semitism is the means of counter-revolution. This tenet, in a reversed sense, is an open admission that Bolshevism is, in fact, a form of Jewish domination. Louis Levine, president of the Jewish Council of Russian Relief, visited the Soviet Union after the Second World War, and wrote a series of articles under the title Soviet Russia Today, in which he testifies to the greatness and unchangeability of this domination. He writes, among other things, "Special concern for the Jewish people has characterized the Soviet Union since its birth in 1917. A week after Tsarism was overthrown, the infant socialist government, headed by Lenin, abolished national oppression, making it the first country in the world to declare anti-Semitism a crime." He also mentions with pride that many famous surgeons, generals, and top officials of the Soviet are Jews. This same Levine, in the course of a speech in Chicago on October 30, 1946, while giving a full account of his visit to Soviet Russia, said, "Many of the high-ranking government officials in Russia are Jewish. Many other Jewish officials did not look Jewish, but they spoke to me privately in Hebrew or Yiddish. The Jewish people are unanimous in their love for Stalin. They regard him as the greatest friend of the Jewish people. They attribute to his understanding of national minorities and to his leadership the new exalted status of Soviet Jews. Jewish rule is the sacred legacy of Bolshevism." Referring to those Jews holding key positions in the Bolshevik system, Lenin himself said, "The role of Jewry will be most important in laying the foundations of the New World Order. Jewry possesses adaptable characteristics together with outstanding intelligence and extreme cruelty. A Russian could never treat Russian counter-revolutionaries as cruelly as a Jew can." Lenin, God of the Godless, by F. Ossendowski. In the modern dictatorship, everything is under the control of a hidden power. More precisely, under the control of the person or group wielding the Tommy gun. The foregoing statement and the frank testimony of a leading Jewish personality shows clearly that in the Soviet Union this absolute power, which is based on the activities of 1 million Jews in key positions, is actually the power exerted by Jewry over Soviet Russia. A Jew is a Jew more than anything else, even when actively engaged in promoting the cause of Bolshevism. First and foremost, he is a Jew, and only afterwards is he a Bolshevik, just as he is a Jew primarily before becoming a champion of democracy. He regards the establishment of Jewish power and security as a matter of supreme importance. Only upon its achievement will he impart a Jewish character to Bolshevism or to democracy, as the case may be. Therefore, it can be truthfully stated that in fact Soviet Russia is not under Bolshevik dictatorship but under Jewish dictatorship. Bolshevism, like liberal democracy, serves only as an excuse and a cloak. From Jewry's point of view, Bolshevism represents a higher phase of the development of Jewish power than democracy does. In a democratic government, the danger always exists that at some time clear-sighted statesmen or skilled demagogues might succeed in exposing the illegal hidden power and in unmasking its holders. Though Jewry may control nearly everything in democracy, there remains, perhaps, a 2% chance of losing everything. But in the Soviet Union there is not even a 0.5% chance of this. For here, the power in the hands of the Jews is absolute. The Russian people are reduced to the status of bondsmen, cannon fodder and slave laborers to the Jewish power. But let us have a closer look at that liberal democracy which, when it entered the war, became the ally of Russia, thanks to the efforts of Roosevelt and his brains trust. Are the United States still the America of Washington, Lincoln, and Jefferson? Whilst the capture of power in Russia was achieved with the help of the Tommy gun, the same feat can be repeated in the case of liberal democracy also, only by different means. Here Jewish leadership can be materialized through the monopoly of the press, of gold and of currency control, and by secretly influencing public life. As we mentioned earlier, when America entered the Second World War, out of Roosevelt's 72 advisors, 52 were Jews. According to the Hidden Empire, 80% of the national income of the United States is controlled by Jews. Behind Roosevelt, there were all the great world bankers with a financial network covering the whole of the globe. When Roosevelt came to power, the State Department and the key positions of the government immediately began to be penetrated. Parallel with this penetration, a great purge began in the ranks of the officers of the armed forces, as a result of which officers with Nazi tendencies were sacked, i.e. those who probably would not be too enthusiastic to fight Roosevelt's war. Robert Edward Edmondson, in his book, I Testify, page 46, paints an original picture of the Roosevelt administration, depicting it in the shape of the Magen-David, six-pointed star. In the middle of the star, Roosevelt can be seen with his administration surrounded on four sides by L. D. Brandeis, Felix Frankfurter, Bernard M. Baruch and Henry Morgenthau Jr. On the 6 points of the star the following names are to be found, showing those who have actual power, those who, in fact, are running the government of the United States. 1. Rabbi Wise, Sidney Hillman, Samuel Dickstein, Herbert H. Lehman, James P. Warburg, Samuel I. Roseman. 2. Dave Stern, Henry Horner, Louis Kirstein, David J. Sapas, E. A. Goldenweiser, Rabbi Samuel Margos. 3. A. Cohen, Gerald Swope, Adolph J. Sabbath, Isidore Lubin Jr., Mordechai Ezekiel, Moise J. Olgan. 4. Samuel Untermeyer, Benjamin J. Cardoso, F. H. LaGuardia, Dave Dubinsky, Jerome Frank. Robert Moses. 5. A. Goldman, W. C. Bullitt, A. J. Altenmeyer, L. A. Steinhardt, Albert Einstein, Rose Scheiderman. 6. H. Faze, Ben Cohen, Nathan Margold, Walter Lippmann, David E. Lilienthal, William M. Liserson. This is a terrible power, when we remember that it was supported by the entire press, all the editors of which were Jews, led by Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, and by the whole radio network under David Sharnoff, and also by the Hollywood cinema propaganda industry with its 95% Jewish majority, led by Adolf Zucker. Neither must we omit the various political labor factions and unions directed by Sidney Hillman, Dubinsky, and similar people, nor the various courts of justice in which by this time Jews passed judgment over the descendants of the early pioneers. Closely associated with this power we find LaGuardia, the mayor of the greatest city in the USA, and around him legions of Jewish communists, as well as Herbert H. Lehman, the Jewish governor of New York State. Then there are Einstein, Oppenheimer, Leo Szilard, and Lilienthal, the high priests of the new atomic sect, reinforced by revengeful masses of refugees from Germany, Italy, Spain, Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Poland coming to occupy key positions in American war production. They contributed propaganda for the War Office, 95% of which was imbued with a hatred akin to that found in the texts of the Old Testament. From these positions, they prepared a war of revenge from which mercy and decency were excluded, not to mention the chivalry of past ages. Thus they degraded the war to the level of a series of bestial massacres. By means of UNO, they prepared to exchange American key positions for ministerial rank in the cabinet of the future world government. Ben-Gurion and Chaim Weizmann stood by in readiness to revive and to re-establish one of the main pillars of world rule, the State of Israel. They issued their orders to the soldiers of Washington, and replaced the White Cross insignia on the steel helmets of the American 6th Division with the Magen-David, six-pointed star. They ordered the bombing not only of Germany, but of all the monuments of European culture. They delivered arms to the Soviet Union and gave her $11,000 billion out of the pocket of the American taxpayer. This Jewish nationalism bears no ill will towards the Soviet Union. But if Hitler should win, or if the Christian nations should make peace among themselves, then that would mean the end of world domination. But if the warriors of the two different phases follow the plans of the elders of Zion and join forces, they will surely establish their rule. Then the capitalist and Bolshevik leaders of the same nationalism will dominate the world. This is a gigantic coalition of the ill-informed American population and the 200 million mass of Soviet Russia's enslaved peoples. The Stalin-Ribbentrop Pact was itself a snare to entrap Germany. The scruples and misgivings of the German General Staff, trained on the doctrines of Clausewitz against a war on two fronts, had to be dispelled. It was thus easier to bring the Germans into the Second World War, which was actually declared on them by the Jewish Congress as early as 1933. When Hitler later found himself in the war up to his neck, suddenly Molotov, the husband of the beautiful Karpovskaja, appears in Berlin and places on the table the Soviet demands. Those Jews who had temporarily vanished through the trapdoor of the Kremlin in August 1939, all reappear on the scene once more. Hitler now had a terrible war on his hands on many fronts. Meanwhile, the new immigrants poured into the United States demanding vengeance. Immigration had, by this time, become an exclusive Jewish right and privilege. The Jewish synagogue in 1930 had an active membership of 4,081,242. But according to the World Almanac of 1949, this number must have increased quickly, since in 1947 membership was up to 4,770,647. Jews were now making up a considerable percentage of the yearly immigration figures. In 1936, this percentage was 17.21%, in 1937 22.59%, in 1938 29.07%, in 1939 52.35%, in 1940 52.21%, in 1941 45.83%, in 1942 36.86%, and in 1943 13.83%. These Jewish newcomers, immigrants from Eastern European countries, did not settle at the bottom of American society. They did not live the wretched life of refugees. On the contrary, they were fitted into jobs in the American press, in offices, politics, and the film world. They were no longer traders and businessmen. They were the carriers of that hatred, vengeance, and Bolshevism which destroyed Holy Russia. All that rottenness, which in the first place had called National Socialism to life and caused the downfall of the Weimar Republic, now became firmly resettled in America, where, according to the book, The Iron Curtain Over America, the term Fourth Reich became the nickname for those districts overrun and occupied by immigrants who had fled from Hitler. Their voices were to be heard in the broadcasts on American radio networks. They spoke in 10 or 15 languages. Their articles were read by millions in the national papers. The humanitarian methods of American democracy were not satisfactory to these people. So they praised the Soviet in America and strained every effort to threaten the destruction of American democracy should it be reluctant to help the Soviet Union sufficiently. For them, the real friend and liberator was not America but the Soviet Union. In the issue of the New York Herald Tribune of December 22, 1938, appeared a letter from Mrs. Sarah Finkelstein protesting against an earlier article, in which it was alleged that out of the 400,000 Jews of Chicago, very few became members of the Communist Party. Sarah Finkelstein says in her letter that she had lived in Chicago for 13 years and thus knew by experience that 98% of the 400,000 Jews of Chicago were all convinced communists. And now simultaneously, nemesis on mankind proceeded from both New York and the Kremlin. It was the Jews' war, and the peace would be theirs too. Whoever wins this war, we will be the real victors. Chapter 8. The real victors of the Second World War. When America entered the Second World War, many people believed that the greatest democracy in the world was going to fight for the principles of the Atlantic Charter. Footnote 2. A document containing 8 points drawn up by Mr. Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt on a warship in the Atlantic in August 1941. Although a very important document since it declared the intentions of Britain and USA, it remained informal and was not in fact signed, to obviate necessity for approval by the U.S. Senate. The 8 points were briefly as follows: 1. No aggrandizement. 2. No territorial changes without wishes of the inhabitants. 3. Restoration of self-government to those deprived of it. 4. Access to trade and raw materials by all peoples. 5. Improvement of labor standards and social security. 6. Freedom from fear and want. 7. Right to traverse the high seas without hindrance. 8. Disarmament of aggressor nations pending permanent system of general security. End of footnote 2. Lying propaganda deceived the 83% majority of Americans against the war into believing that Bolshevism was the same as democracy, that Soviet terrorism was freedom, and therefore that it was absolutely necessary to cross the ocean and save humanity. A certain part of belligerent Europe was also taken in by this propaganda. Those who organized the resistance movements and those reluctant to enter the war on the side of the Axis powers were all hoping that Roosevelt would not let loose the pest of Bolshevism on Europe. Every superficial sign seemed to indicate that after all, American capitalism and Soviet Bolshevism could never be brought together into a lasting alliance. It seemed beyond all belief that American democracy was waging ideological war against the German form of dictatorship, in alliance with the most cruel dictatorship of all. But this appearance was misleading. For supranational Jewish Nazism was the real cohesive force of the alliance, that force which, as we already know, played such an important part in the Roosevelt administration as well as in the Soviet system of Stalin and Kaganovich. For those behind the scenes there was one war aim only, the establishment of their absolute world domination. If this cannot be achieved, then according to the ancient principles of divide et impera, the globe must be divided, the Eastern Hemisphere to be ruled by the Tommy gun and the Western Hemisphere by gold, but Tommy gun and gold are to be in the same hands. One world. Is it not written in the holy book of the Jewish Führer, and thou shalt consume all the people which the Lord thy God shall deliver to them? Deuteronomy 7:16. Let us not forget that all-out warfare was not invented by modern strategists and that Torah, the main camp of the Jews, points the way of those fighting for the one-world principle. But thus shall ye deal with them, ye shall destroy their altars, and break down their images, and cut down their groves, and burn their graven images with fire. Deuteronomy 7:5. Ye shall destroy their altars. The Atlantic Charter is to be perceived here with its shop window propaganda, the text of which was written by Samuel Roseman according to Time magazine, August 18, 1941. Let American boys believe they are fighting for higher ideals. But, say the protocols, the real plans will be known by us, to the exclusion of everybody else. Violence and hypocrisy. Though the Atlantic Charter is what we promised, it is not freedom we are preparing for the world, but absolute and total servitude. We will tell the Germans that we want to eliminate the Nazis only, but our plans are ready and we are going to put them into effect. And so in 1941, even before America entered the war, certain plans by Maurice Gomberg were published relating to a new world moral order for permanent peace and freedom. Maurice Gomberg, Philadelphia, February, 1942. See page 104 of E. J. Reichenberger's book Europa in Trümmern, Europe in Ruins. This is shown on a map printed in Philadelphia. It is the most incriminating evidence against those who dreamed of exterminating whole nations and races before America was even at war. The work is presented in such a way as to appear to be a draft of a world map after the Second World War, when the United States, meaning, by then, the Jewish world government, would take control of the whole world and would establish the new world moral order to ensure lasting peace, freedom, justice, and security, and to carry out reconstruction. According to the map, Canada, Greenland, the Azores, and the Canary Islands, as well as innumerable smaller islands between Japan and Australia, belong to the USA as protectorates. Sumatra, Java, and Borneo are annexed to the British Empire. The frontiers of the Soviet Union extend from Vladivostok to Cologne, and the Rhine is the western frontier of Bolshevism. Our frontiers are on the Rhine, did not Roosevelt say? Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, and Romania are shown as member states of the USSR. This map is another shocking proof that the aim of world Jewry is to rob small nations of their independence and drive the whole world under the yoke of its reign of terror. Austria and Germany, colored on this map in red, are put into quarantine. China appears to remain an independent state, but Iran is shown on the map as part of the Soviet Union. France, Italy, Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Spain, and Portugal appear on the map as members of the new United States of Europe. But the accompanying explanatory notes are even more interesting than the map itself, as we learn from them that a new world moral order must be built up. In this new moral order, Talmudic morals will have the upper hand. This is the despotism of the Jewish world state. It is from us that the all-engulfing terror proceeds, say the protocols, and the organizers of the New World Order are here evidently listing everything they have dreamed of and wish to put into effect. It will be quite sufficient to expose here the most important points of these plans. The Soviet Union, collaborating with the USA to preserve freedom and peace, will obtain exclusive control over Austria and Germany, in order to re-educate these states and afterwards to annex them as equal members of the USSR. After the war, the Holy Land, known at present as Palestine, is to be united to Transjordania and adjoining territories by historical right, as well as on the ground of the necessity of having a demilitarized independent Jewish republic to facilitate the solution of the refugee problem. This Jewish territory is marked on the map as Heberland. As to war criminals, there was as yet no Moscow Declaration in existence, since, apart from the Bromberg massacres, there was no knowledge of any war crimes. Nevertheless, American world Jewry was already proclaiming Nuremberg in advance. Clause number 30 on the map states, "The criminal perpetrators and their partners in guilt of this hideous war shall be brought to justice and unforgettable punishment administered." The plans for the murder and deportation of whole nations were also ready and were put into effect at Potsdam, where the schemes worked out by world Jewry as early as 1940 were obediently signed by the Allied nations. We learn from the notes on the map that Japanese subjects as well as persons of Japanese origin and therefore of doubtful allegiance are to be expelled from the Western Hemisphere forever. They are similarly to be expelled from islands under U.S. protection. Their assets are to be confiscated and put towards the cost of post-war reconstruction. All Germans and Italian subjects, as well as persons closely associated to them, who spread Nazi and fascist ideology, are to be treated likewise. It is revealing that the government of the U.S. is unable even today to refund the seized German assets of $300 million. German, Italian, and Japanese immigration to the Western Hemisphere as well as to all islands under the protectorate of the USA is to be stopped indefinitely. Here world Jewry again reverts to the ancient commandments of Torah, which aim at securing undivided Jewish rule over the Western Hemisphere. "Thou shalt smite them, and utterly destroy them, thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor show mercy unto them." Deuteronomy 7:2. For the purpose of cleansing the Axis aggressors of military chauvinism, of smashing their military power, or recovering booty, and of re-educating them to return to the family circle of nations, states Clause 36 of the World Plan, German, Japanese and Italian territories are to be put in quarantine for an indefinite duration of time and are to be administered by governors under the supervision of the United Nations. Well, here we find foreshadowed well before the outbreak of war, events which actually took place after 1945. And have we not seen the payment of reparations made by Western Germany to Israel, together with the occupation of much of Europe by the re-educators, CIC agents and the dismantlers of the attempted but frustrated Morgenthau Plan, and finally the governing on behalf of Jewry of European territories by Russian and American stooges? The magnitude of Jewry's world conquest is demonstrated by the fact that of all the war aims and promises, including the Atlantic Charter, the only plans achieved were those above mentioned together with some small adjustments. All raw materials and industrial production of territories under quarantine, continues Clause 37 of the World Order, will be used for post-war reconstruction. Other clauses explain that all persons born in East Prussia or the Rhineland will be expelled from the occupied territories and their estates confiscated for reparations. For potential military reasons, a plan must be elaborated to control the birth rate of the territories in quarantine and thus reduce the numerical strength of the aggressor nations. This is the very first instance in the history of mankind that a nationalist minority has openly renounced a law of nature and proclaimed its intention of destroying other nations. "And thou shalt consume all the people which the Lord thy God shall deliver thee," declares Torah. This is the opportunity, therefore, to expatriate the people of East Prussia, the Rhineland and other eastern countries. 25 million displaced Christians must be expelled from their native lands. Birth rate control must be introduced and the Morgenthau Plan, which could bring about the starvation of 40% of the German population, must be put into operation. Never can world Jewry efface these terrible murder charges. The more so, since it not only prepared the plans but, as we will see later, executed them too. The Gomberg Massacre Plan, backed by most powerful American Jewish organizations, and its methods are not new. Several thousands of years ago, Moses had prescribed for this tribal Nazism how a war must be conducted, as well as how to make peace. And when the Lord thy God hath delivered it, the city, into thy hands, thou shalt smite every male thereof with the edge of the sword. But the women, and the little ones, and the cattle, and all that is in the city, even all the spoil thereof, shalt thou take unto thyself. Deuteronomy XX 13-14. The Atlantic Charter is still on display in the shop window of Promises. Samuel Fried, the well-known Zionist and pacifist, during the early part of the 1930s, while still in the flush of the First World War victory, does not hide the mass murderer psychosis which is to be found in the drafts of the later peace treaties. People dreading the revival of German power will never again see the restoration of Germany's military might. We will nip in the bud every effort to restore it, and finally, should the danger persist, we will destroy this nation hated by everybody, both by partition and also by dismembering the country, as well as by ruthless mass murders. In 1934, Samuel Roth characterized the intense hatred later manifested in the propaganda and peace plans of the Second World War. In his book Jews Must Live, edited by the Golden Press Incorporated, he writes as follows. We are still the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We mix with the nations under the pretext that we are fleeing from persecution, we, the most ruthless persecutors whose cruelty is unmatched in the annals of the history of mankind. Before 1945, there was a widespread belief that the so-called Bolshevik Jew, being filled with resentment and bitterness, had no chance to become cultured and thus turned into a sadist directly he got a Tommy gun in his hand. But the cultured Western Jews are different, went the popular dictum. They were humanitarians and philanthropists who contributed generously to the Red Cross and towards the funds of free meal relief. Only the bloody terror of Mandel Rothschild, the French Home Secretary, foreshadowed in 1940 the fate Europe could expect once these humanitarians returned to the continent as victors. This Mandel Rothschild executed several hundreds of French people in the name of national unity, demanding resistance from every Frenchman against the German peril. Later, when the French front collapsed, Mandel Rothschild was the first to flee from France. But by this time his hands were covered with the blood of hundreds of French people. His political conduct was the first revelation of the intense passion and animosity hidden under the Western Jew's cloak of culture and humanity. When at the beginning of the Second World War the voice of the Western press and radio became savagely distorted and slogans of a humanitarian world were broadcast, such as, "Make the Germans eat arsenic," by a U.S. columnist, evidence multiplied to show that this was no longer a warlike spirit, still less one of the Geneva Convention, but one of sheer murder. It is extraordinary to hear men of high intellectual capacity, such as writers, university professors, and publicists, all suddenly speaking in the middle of the 20th century the language of Old Testament prophets inciting to murder. It is a shock to realize that in the security of Freemasonic lodges, democratic editorial offices, and Zionist associations, books, articles, essays, and political speeches are conceived and written, all proclaiming murder. These are not the unavoidable casualties of war, but murders and cruelties planned for the ensuing peace. Theodore Nathan Kaufman, in his book, Germany Must Perish, edited at Newark, see page 104, wrote as early as 1941 that after the war Germany must be completely dismembered. Kaufman demanded that the German population, both male and female, surviving the aerial bombings, be sterilized in order to secure the total extinction of the German race. The same hatred flares up in Maurice Leon Dodd's book How Many World Wars, New York, 1942, in which the author proclaims that no Germany and no German race must be left after this war. Charles G. Hartman in his book There Must Be No Germany After War, New York, 1942, also demands the physical extermination of the German people. Einzig Pallo, a Canadian Jewish writer, in his book Can We Win the Peace? London, 1942, takes a similar stand demanding the dismembering of Germany and the total demolition of German industry. Ivor Duncan, another Jewish writer, in his article Die Quelle Pan-Germanismus, which appeared in the March 1942 issue of Central Europa Observer, demanded the sterilization of 40 million Germans. He estimated the total cost of his scheme to be £5 million. Douglas Miller, writing in the New York Times in 1942, states that 70 million Germans are too many. Exports and imports must therefore be so regulated that more than 40 million Germans will starve. In the library of the American House in Munich, on page 456 of an American book entitled Joy Street, by Keyes, written for the greater glory of overseas propaganda, we read, as Major David Solomont said, "Could I have had the chance to choose my job in this war, I should have picked the same task I was actually assigned. Right through France, right into Germany, to destroy everything. Never in history has there been such a war. I'm glad that I can tell my grandchildren that I was there and took part in the revenge. I thank God for this. When finally we reached Germany, we began to destroy and devastate everything. Then I realized that this was what I was waiting for, this was what I was living for. My only regret is that I was unable to destroy and kill more as we had not much time left for it. When we reached Wiesbaden, our tempo became slower, for there was nothing left we could attack, bomb or kill. We made such a perfect job that we had to stop for a while." These are the Atlantic charters of the ambitious men who are seeking to Bolshevize the world and to destroy the nations, and they have been, to a great extent, realized. Thus the great vision of the protocols lives through the war. At times it may appear to be sheer propaganda. But barbarism is contagious, and eventually responsible officials are infected with it. Behind Morgenthau, Harry Dexter White and other champions of culture drew up plans for the total destruction of Germany. The Atlantic Charter may promise freedom, but the proposals of the World Federalists are ready too. These are the dreams of the same unique supranational Nazism. To abolish all national frontiers together with the freedom and independence of the nations and to establish world government, precisely as prescribed by the protocols. In place of the rulers of today, we shall set up a bogey which will be called the Super Government Administration. Its hands will reach out in all directions like nippers, and its organization will be of such colossal dimensions that it cannot fail to subdue all the nations of the world. Protocol V. There is little doubt that the commands of the protocols were obeyed by the United World Federalists during the war when they submitted proposals for a world government. These proposals were the exact opposite of those principles laid down in the Atlantic Charter. The nations must surrender their sovereignty to a world government because the age of independent nations is over, emphasized Robert Hutchins, Chancellor of the University of Chicago. All armies, fleets, air forces, and atomic bombs must be under the world government. The Panama Canal, Gibraltar, Okinawa, the Dardanelles, Aden, Singapore, and the Kiel Canal must all be under the administration of the world government. The laws of immigration and citizenship must be abolished. A world court and a world bank must be established. The world government must be formed. The most important thing is to destroy that dangerous perversion called patriotism. One world. One world government consisting of the 52 Jewish advisors of Roosevelt's Brains Trust. In the place of patriotic independent countries, there will remain but one country, a country belonging to the world conquerors. There will be one patriotism only, that of Jewish world nationalism. Not only Jews take part in this feverish planning. Behind them are Fabian socialists, the Freemasonic lodges, and even certain sects of the Protestant Church. Only some time later did we learn from the investigations of the McCarthy Committee as well as from John T. Flynn's book The Road Ahead, how powerful a certain sect of American Protestantism had grown during the Second World War, which saw in the Bolshevik system the fulfillment of certain of Christ's ideals. This was the same sort of aberration which bemused the Christian world about 700 years ago, when told of Genghis Khan's conquests. But the rumor spread that in the east a great Christian empire had arisen, not the empire of the Mongols, but that of Prester John. He, it was said, ruled Christ's earthly kingdom, which would be soon established in Europe, thus fulfilling the ideals of Christendom. This was one of the superstitions of the Middle Ages, whereas the rumor connected with the Soviet was nothing else but carefully planned propaganda originating from Freemasonic lodges and Jewish circles. Marxists infiltrated into the ranks of the Council of Churches in America and started to spread the remarkable theory of God's kingdom. According to Dr. Jones, America represents best quality in individualism, whilst Russia stands for best quality in collectivism. But this kingdom of God is not the kingdom of Christ, which is not of this world. It is the kingdom of Jehovah, the empire of Old Testament Nazism. This is the kingdom of David foretold by the protocols and represents absolute and unchallenged rule over the whole globe. But many, many battles, much bloodshed, scheming and aerial bombing are required to achieve this. For though bloodstained and bombed, Europe still stands between Western and Eastern cooperative man, between the Western and Eastern Jew. Ye shall destroy their altars, and break down their images, and cut down their groves, and burn their graven images with fire. Deuteronomy 7:5. The target of the bombing was by this time no longer German National Socialism but the Munich Pinakothek, the houses of the workers and the monastery of Monte Cassino where the Christian culture of Europe was born. The 2,000 years of Christianity were the target now, together with its symbol, Christ's crucifix, which was spat upon by the Polish grandfathers of Morgenthau while passing over the plains of Poland. Jean and Jerome Thérade, in the shadow of the crucifix. It can be proved that Jewry thwarted all efforts during the Second World War to reach an armistice and establish peace and understanding. Roosevelt's brain's trust was behind the demand for unconditional surrender, and by his own personal appearance at Casablanca, Morgenthau forced Roosevelt to be uncompromising in demanding it. By this move, Jewry succeeded in prolonging the war for 2 more years. Even were there no proofs of Jewry's aspirations, the notorious Morgenthau Plan would still remain as an eternally incriminating document. It could not be proved, even in Nuremberg, that it was the intention of the Hitler regime to annihilate Jewry. Nevertheless, Jewry, in its blind thirst for revenge, wished to destroy 40% of the 90 million Germans. The Morgenthau Plan is a grandiose, undeniable historical proof of this. Jewry wished in cold-blooded premeditation to murder an entire nation. It is characteristic that the full details of this plan were never published in America. Perhaps this would have been too much even for American public opinion. But the plans of Mr. Morgenthau, Secretary of the Treasury in Roosevelt's administration, aimed at depriving Germany of her industry and of all means of livelihood. Even the growing of sugar beet was forbidden. "We will turn Germany into a pastoral country," stated Morgenthau's broadcasting service. The Quebec Agreement is another undeniable proof of this in writing. The purpose of this program is to transform Germany into a mainly agricultural and nomadic state. William L. Newman, Making the Peace, 1941–1945, page 73. Who is Morgenthau? McFadden, an American congressman, had this to say of him in Congress on January 24, 1934. Through marriage he is connected with Herbert Lehman, Jewish governor of New York State, and through marriage or in some other way he is in relationship with Seligman, owner of the great international banking firm of J. and W. Seligman, who during a Senate investigation was proved to have attempted to bribe a foreign government. Morgenthau is related to Lewinson, the international Jewish banker, and also to the Warburgs who together control Kuhn, Loeb and Company, the International Acceptance Bank and the Bank of Manhattan, and have, besides, many other financial concerns and interests both at home and abroad. These bankers caused a shortage of $3,000 million in the U.S. Treasury, and they still owe this sum to the Treasury Department and to the U.S. taxpayers. Morgenthau is also connected with the Strauss family and is either related to or connected with various other members of the Jewish banking world in New York, London, Amsterdam and other large financial centers. During the Great Financial Crisis, Morgenthau was Undersecretary to the Treasury. When Roosevelt ordered him to raise the price of gold to $35 per fine ounce, he obeyed with alacrity. And in the evening he made the following entry in his diary. Had the public understood how we fixed the price of gold, they would have received a considerable shock. Morgenthau suggested that Roosevelt should buy up 100 million ounces of silver above the current price, in order to capture the goodwill of senators representing the silver states of the U.S., and thus score Roosevelt's victory at the next presidential elections. Whilst such a use of the taxpayers' money meant splendid business for the family group of the Morgenthau banking houses, and also promoted the presidential re-election of Roosevelt, it brought 450 million Chinese and 350 million Indians into a desperate economic plight. In China, as well as in India, silver is the only metal from which coins are minted, and the price of silver due to the above purchases rose higher and higher. After Roosevelt's silver buying transaction, China could export only by selling her products 1/3 cheaper than previously, and consequently her population suffered more from starvation than before. At that time, whole provinces joined the camp of Mao Zedong, the communist leader. Morgenthau is, therefore, only second to Bernard Baruch as the most powerful leader of Jewry. He is supported by the press, the banking world and nationalist masses of the world conquerors, who are unanimous in their fervor and admiration for him. What Morgenthau does is done with the full approval of the whole of Western Jewry, and he is supported by Eastern Jewry as well. Some time later, in the Press Club of Hamburg, Christopher Enel, the well-known American radio commentator, made some very interesting disclosures about the origin of the Morgenthau Plan. During the treason trials of Alger Hiss, it was shown that the Morgenthau Plan was worked out by the Communists with the help of the Soviet Union. Only after the McCarthy investigations was it possible to clarify the real facts. Behind Mr. Morgenthau, the Western Jewish banker, there was another dark figure, Harry Dexter White, Assistant Undersecretary of the U.S. Treasury Department. The latter was born in America, but his parents came from Russia, the land of pogroms, and so brought with them all the fanaticism and hatred of Eastern Jews. Later, as one of the directors of the International Monetary Fund appointed by President Truman to represent the USA, he became one of the chief members of the spy ring working for the Soviet under the direction of Nathan Gregory Silvermaster, a government official in an executive capacity, appointed by Roosevelt. He was the author of the notorious Morgenthau Plan. Morgenthau, who was then Secretary of the Treasury, took it with him to the famous Quebec Conference. The Memoirs of Cordell Hull, American Secretary of State, 1933 to the Power of 14, testify what this double-faced tribal nationalism intended to do. According to Cordell Hull, the Morgenthau Plan aimed at the massacre, enslavement and liquidation of the German people. Shortly after the return of the president, writes Cordell Hull, I told him angrily that the Morgenthau Plan contradicts common sense and could never be adopted by the U.S. government. I told him that the plan would wipe out Germany from the face of the earth forever, whilst 40% of her population would starve to death as the land can feed only 60% of her population. The war propaganda was first concentrated on the necessity of defeating the Nazis. But when the Jews thought they had won the war, they wished to exterminate the whole nation. At that time, no Jew pointed out that the principle of collective punishment might, like the proverbial boomerang, return to strike the thrower. When the Morgenthau Plan was completed, Jewry was able to repeat. The emblem of our people, the symbolic serpent, has closed its coils again. We are the nation wielding the power of a victorious Nazism. Winston Churchill, the premier of the victorious British Empire, is still at Quebec. Possibly he still represents the Real England and, at any rate, it was he who, in 1920, wrote a spirited anti-Semitic article, and whose better conscience is still in arms to prevent the peace that follows the war being turned into vengeance. This Churchill has no idea what everlasting hatred feels like. He still fondly believes that England has won the war, therefore we will show him that there is no real power or real victor any more in the Christian world which has been ruined in this fratricidal war, except ourselves, the people of Morgenthau. And should he be reluctant to believe it, then he too must be made acquainted with the might of Judah. During the Quebec Conference, Morgenthau pointed the knife of Shylock at Churchill's breast. He could either accept the Morgenthau plan or let Britain go bankrupt. He must either support Jewry's revenge, in which case Britain would receive a $6,500 million loan, or else he must announce national bankruptcy, and that even before the war was over. What else do they want from me? Do they expect me to sit up and beg like a dog, asks the old British stalwart indignantly. But at his side sits the atom physicist, Lord Charwell, his good friend, whose original name was Lindemann and who is of the same blood as Morgenthau. And he explains to Churchill that he has no choice but to accept the terms, so great by now is the victory of Morgenthau's nation, world Jewry. Are all these things nightmarish dreams of Sadducees, or are they plans of 20th century writers, publicists, and statesmen? Are these people in consultation politicians, or sadists? How the peace was prepared is told by the pro-red Richard B. Scandrett, one of the members of the American Reparations Commission. His account was recorded in Congressional Records, June 7, 1945. Germany will not exist any longer. Only German provinces under Russian, American, or British colonial governments. In these the living standards will be lowered to the level of the concentration camps and exile territories of Siberia. All classes of Germans will be ruthlessly forced down to the same level. As a final solution, these territories will be governed by a reparations committee of the United Nations, and this committee will decide how many Germans are needed in each of the provinces to secure the standard of minimum agricultural production. All German males not needed for this scheme are to be conscripted into compulsory labor battalions and sent to America or Soviet Russia, especially to those regions of Russia destroyed during the war. No regard is to be paid in the enslavement to the education, family connections, or dependent wives or children of the German deportees. No exemptions to be made of the clergy either. Full understanding was reached between America and the USSR regarding the question of religion in Eastern Europe. The Russian Orthodox Church, after regaining the favor of the Kremlin, will be the official religion in the Baltic republics, Poland, Eastern Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. The Roman Catholics will be cut off from Rome. The Society for the Prevention of World War III, the most fanatically Old Testament organization of Morgenthau, especially demanded that the revengeful clause relating to the dismembering of Germany be carried out. 1. Germans should be expelled from neutral countries. American businessmen should be given no visa to visit Germany. For the next 25 years, no German person may receive any visa to visit America. Marriage with German women is to be forbidden, and German women may not enter the USA. Postal communication with Germany is not to be restored. All these stipulations were signed not by dictators, but by such brave champions of freedom as F. W. Forster, Julius Goldstein, Isidor Lischitz, Emil Ludwig, Erich Mann, Cedric Forster, E. Amsel Moore, Guy Emery, Schippler, W. E. Shire, and Louis Neiser. But they were not Bolsheviks. They were all civilized men of the Western world. That Jewry planned all this is proved, not only by the quotations above, but also by the German people themselves who saw this too and fought so fanatically against it. It is through me that king's reign, proclaims Protocol V. And in Quebec the subdued Churchill bows before Eastern and Western world power, before the earthly God, the power of gold. The new world state can now come. Now the glorious day of the kingdom of God is at hand. Behold! From the east our victorious Bolshevik armies are attacking a rapidly shrinking Europe. There they are, Vienna, Budapest, Berlin and Breslau in flames. In a single night more than 300,000 East civilian refugees perish amid the downpour of bombs from our liberators. In our humanity we scatter graphite powder in the air. The air is burning. Mothers and their children are stifled. We fulfill Jehovah's commandment. The graven images of their God shall ye burn with fire, Ye shall cut down their groves, and shall destroy them with a mighty destruction, until they be destroyed. Under a burning firmament our soldiers are attacking. They are the almond-eyed Mongolians and the semi-savage people of Turkestan and Central Asia, with American Tommy guns in their hands and American rubber boots on their feet. Behind them come the American Sherman tanks. They are coming to liberate our future rulers from the concentration camps, to release our brothers. And Jews breaking out from the barbed wire enclosures of concentration camps embrace Soviet soldiers, quite understandably and with delirious joy. These are our liberators. And Europe, reduced in part to ashes and smoldering ruins, looks up from the debris and from the cellars to see Soviet commissars, and the arrival of the Morgenthau boys in the wake of the American army. Europe scarcely dares to heave a sigh as she watches the real victors of the Second World War. End of Part 2 of World Conquerors, The Real War Criminals. 1958. Chapters 5 through 8. By Louis Marschalko. This audio-video book was recorded, edited and produced on August 30, 2023, by Joey Faust and the Phoenix Party Christian Fascists. Your only salvation in this Jewish world of darkness. Amen. If you found this video informative or useful, please consider leaving a small tip or donation of appreciation. Thank you and God bless. The end.